At his own wedding, a millionaire saw his pregnant ex-wife working as a waitress. He was not prepared for what happened next. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The city skyline glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite where Eric Kingston stood, gazing at his reflection in the glass. He adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored tuxedo, his fingers momentarily pausing over the polished silver as if their weight had suddenly increased. The murmur of voices and clinking champagne glasses drifted in from the adjoining ballroom, where guests were already celebrating the engagement of the year, the wedding of Eric Kingston and Belinda Westmore. Everything was perfect. Or at least, that was what everyone kept telling him. The venue was one of the most prestigious in the city, reserved exclusively for those with influence and wealth. The air buzzed with anticipation, the polished marble floors reflecting the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, and the scent of fresh roses, Belinda's favorite, permeated the air. Eric had spared no expense, but that was to be expected. He was, after all, a man of success, a self-made entrepreneur whose empire had flourished under his leadership. His life, from the outside, appeared to be the embodiment of ambition fulfilled. And yet, standing alone in the suite, he felt something gnawing at the edges of his mind, a persistent unease, a hollow echo in the place where the certainty should have been. A soft knock at the door disrupted his thoughts. Belinda entered gracefully, a vision in white despite it only being the engagement party. Her sleek designer dress hugged her figure in all the right ways, her platinum blonde hair cascading in controlled waves over one shoulder. She was the epitome of elegance, confidence radiating from her every movement. "There you are," she said smoothly, stepping toward him with the poised assurance of a woman who was always in control. "The guests are waiting, and they want to see you." Eric forced a smile. "I was just taking a moment." Belinda placed her hands on his lapels, smoothing out a wrinkle that wasn't really there. "Second thoughts?" she teased, though there was an edge to her voice that suggested she would tolerate no such thing. "Of course not." His response was automatic, well-rehearsed. She studied him for a moment, her ice-blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You've been distant lately," she observed. "Is it work?" Work. An easy excuse, a justifiable distraction. He almost latched onto it, but something inside him hesitated. "I guess I've just been thinking," he admitted, more to himself than to her. Belinda's lips curled into a knowing smile as she slid her arms around his neck. "You're probably just overwhelmed. It's a big moment, Eric. You're marrying a woman who truly understands you, a woman who's on your level." She said it so effortlessly, as if it was an undeniable fact, a woman on his level. The words settled uncomfortably in his chest. Images of another woman flickered through his mind, dark curls framing a warm, expressive face, laughter that was never forced, eyes that once looked at him as if he was her whole world. Jasmine. A ghost from a life that now seemed impossibly distant. For a fleeting moment, he thought of their small apartment, the late-night conversations over instant ramen, the way she had believed in him even when he barely believed in himself. She had been there for every failure, every rejection, standing by his side when no one else would. And yet, where was she now? The past had been neatly severed, left behind like an outdated version of himself that no longer fit the life he had built. That was what he had told himself when he signed the divorce papers. But then, why did her name still taste like regret on his tongue? Belinda's fingers traced his jawline, pulling his attention back to her. "Whatever it is, just put it aside for tonight. This is our moment." Eric exhaled and nodded, pushing the memories back into the recesses of his mind. He offered Belinda his arm, the perfect fiancée once again. "Let's go," he said. As they stepped into the grand ballroom, applause erupted, cameras flashing, glasses raised in celebration. The city's elite surrounded them, congratulating, admiring, envying. Belinda smiled, basking in the glow of admiration. Eric smiled too. And yet, beneath the surface of it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The memory of Jasmine was like a persistent ember, refusing to be extinguished no matter how much Eric tried to bury it beneath the weight of his new life. The engagement party had been a dazzling spectacle, a testament to the power and influence he had accumulated over the years. Yet, in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts, he couldn't escape the echoes of his past, the warmth of Jasmine's laughter, the way she used to look at him as if he was the only man in the world. But that life was over. At least, that was what Belinda had told him time and time again. Eric sat in his office, a sleek, modern space that mirrored his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, the leather chair beneath him molded perfectly to his frame. Yet, despite the luxury surrounding him, he felt a gnawing emptiness. Belinda entered without knocking, her usual air of confidence unwavering. She carried a coffee in one hand and a stack of documents in the other, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor. "You're distracted again," she noted, setting the coffee down in front of him. Eric glanced up at her, masking his thoughts behind a carefully constructed expression. "Just thinking about the wedding details," Belinda scoffed lightly. "You don't need to worry about that. Everything is being handled perfectly. Besides, that's what you have me for." She moved around the desk, placing a hand on his shoulder. It was a calculated touch, just enough intimacy to remind him of their connection, yet not too much to suggest genuine emotion. "You made the right choice, you know," she said, her voice smooth, persuasive. "Jasmine was holding you back. She didn't understand what it takes to succeed in this world. But I do." Eric felt a familiar unease settle in his chest. It was a conversation they had had before, many times in fact. It had started subtly, back when he and Jasmine were still married. At first, Belinda's words had been nothing more than off-handed comments. "You know, Eric, successful men like you, they need partners who can match their ambition. Jasmine seems sweet, but do you really think she understands the world you're trying to build? I just think you deserve someone who truly compliments you, someone who doesn't resent the time you put into your work." The seeds had been planted so carefully, so expertly, that Eric hadn't even realized he was being manipulated. Over time, the words became sharper, more direct. "She doesn't fit into your life anymore. She will never understand the sacrifices you have to make. You need someone like me." And Eric, burdened by the pressure of his growing business, frustrated by the tension at home, had started to believe her. Belinda had made herself indispensable. She was there for every late-night strategy meeting, every high-stakes negotiation, every moment when he needed reassurance that he was on the right path. And slowly, Jasmine had become an obstacle, a weight dragging him down. At least, that's what he had told himself when he had walked away. Now, as Belinda spoke, her words echoing those same sentiments, Eric felt a flicker of doubt. Had he truly outgrown Jasmine? Or had he simply been convinced to leave her behind? Belinda seemed to sense his hesitation. She leaned down, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, "Don't dwell on the past, Eric. You and I are building something extraordinary, and nothing, no one, should distract you from that." Eric forced a nod, allowing himself to be pulled back into the version of reality Belinda had so carefully constructed. Yet, even as he agreed with her, the ember of doubt continued to smolder. Eric had always prided himself on his ability to focus, to make decisions based on logic rather than emotion. It was a trait that had served him well in business: ruthless efficiency, strategic detachment. But when it came to Jasmine, that logic had always faltered. He remembered the night they had their first real fight, the night everything began to unravel. It had started with something small, a passing comment Jasmine made when he arrived home late again. He had been so consumed by work that he hadn't noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she clutched her phone like she had been waiting for him to call. "You didn't even text me back," she had said, her voice quieter than usual. Eric had barely looked up as he tossed his keys onto the counter. "I was busy." Jasmine hesitated, then tried again. "I get that, Eric, but lately it feels like—" "Like what?" He had snapped before he could stop himself, the tension from the day spilling over. "Like, I don't matter anymore." Those 5 words had cut through him like a blade, but instead of acknowledging them, he had hardened. He had been tired, frustrated, and, worst of all, influenced by the voice that had been whispering in his ear for months now. The voice that told him Jasmine wasn't enough anymore. "That's not fair," he had said coldly. "Everything I do is for us, Jasmine." "But you wouldn't understand that, would you?" She had flinched, just barely, but he had seen it. And still he hadn't stopped. "You act like I'm the bad guy for working hard," he continued, running a hand through his hair in exasperation. "You have no idea how much pressure I'm under." Jasmine had swallowed hard, her arms wrapping around herself. "I never asked you to stop working, Eric. I just wanted to be a part of it. But every time I try, you push me away." He had scoffed, shaken his head. "Because you don't belong in this world, Jasmine. This isn't you." The moment the words left his mouth, he had regretted them. Jasmine had stared at him, her face unreadable for a long moment. And then she had simply nodded, as if something inside her had clicked into place. "I see," she had said, her voice so quiet it barely reached him. And that had been the beginning of the end. From that night on, the distance between them grew wider. Eric buried himself deeper in work, spent more time with Belinda, and convinced himself that Jasmine was the one pulling away first. Then came the so-called proof. It had arrived in the form of a late-night email, an anonymous message with attached photos. Pictures of Jasmine sitting across from another man at a cafe, their heads close together, their hands brushing as they reached for the same coffee cup. Eric had stared at the images for what felt like an eternity. Belinda had been the first to see his expression shift. She had leaned in, her voice gentle, almost sympathetic. "I'm sorry, Eric," she had murmured. "I didn't want to be the one to show you, but you deserved to know." He hadn't questioned how she had obtained them. He hadn't even considered that the pictures could have been staged, taken out of context, or outright fabricated. All he had felt was betrayal. The confrontation with Jasmine had been brutal. He had accused her without hesitation, throwing the printed photos onto the kitchen counter as if they were irrefutable evidence of her disloyalty. She had picked them up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Where did you get these? Does it matter?" His voice had been sharp, clipped. "Were you with him or not?" Jasmine had let out a slow breath, setting the papers down. "His name is Marcus. He's an old friend. And that night, he was giving me advice on how to save this." She had gestured between them, her eyes pleading with him to listen. But Eric hadn't wanted to listen. "You expect me to believe that?" He had scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're sneaking around with another man, and I'm supposed to just take your word for it?" Jasmine had blinked at him, something breaking in her gaze. For the first time in their relationship, she hadn't defended herself. She hadn't raised her voice or tried to make him understand. Instead, she had looked at him as if she no longer recognized the man standing before her. "If you really believe that I could do this to you," she had said softly, "then we don't have anything left to save, do we?" Silence. Eric had expected her to fight, to cry, to demand that he listen, but she hadn't. Instead, she had walked away. A week later, the divorce papers were on his desk. He hadn't hesitated to sign them. At the time, it had felt like justice, like the natural conclusion to a marriage that had already fallen apart. It was only later, months later, that he realized she had never asked for anything. No alimony, no division of assets, not even the apartment. She had simply left, and he had let her go. The night of the engagement party had passed, leaving behind only carefully curated photographs, flattering media coverage, and a lingering emptiness that Eric couldn't quite explain. By all accounts, the event had been a success. Belinda had made sure of that. She had basked in the attention, her arm linked through his as they smiled for cameras, accepted congratulations, and played the roles they had both perfected. But something had shifted inside Eric that night. It was a small crack at first, an invisible fracture in the foundation of his carefully constructed life. It began as a whisper of doubt, something he could easily ignore in the daylight when he was surrounded by the comforts of success. But now, standing at the center of the grand ballroom of the Kensington Royal Hotel on the night of his wedding reception, that crack had widened into something impossible to ignore. He had done everything right. He had followed the path that had been laid out for him, the one that led to power, wealth, influence. He had cut ties with the past, with the people who no longer fit into his world. He had chosen a woman who understood him, a partner who was as ambitious as he was, as ruthless as she needed to be. So why did it feel like something was missing? The ballroom was filled with the city's elite, their laughter and polished conversation swirling around him like background noise. The air was thick with the scent of roses and expensive champagne, the glow of chandeliers reflecting off the polished marble floors. It was everything Belinda had wanted, an extravagant display of status and perfection. And yet, for all the grandeur surrounding him, Eric felt suffocated. He stepped away from the crowd, making his way toward the bar at the far end of the room. He just needed a moment, a brief escape from the noise and expectation. The bartender recognized him immediately and poured him a glass of scotch without a word. Eric took a slow sip, savoring the burn, and let his gaze wander over the sea of guests. His mind drifted, unbidden, to the past, to a simpler time, a time when he had celebrated victories in a cramped apartment with takeout and laughter that came freely. A time when Jasmine had been by his side. He exhaled sharply, pushing the thought away. That's when he saw her. She was moving through the crowd, her figure partially obscured by the swarm of servers carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It had to be someone else. It had to be anyone else. But then she turned, and the world around him stopped. Jasmine. His breath caught in his throat. She looked different, thinner, as if life had taken something from her, but her posture was as poised as ever. Her uniform, plain and unremarkable, did nothing to hide the quiet strength in the way she carried herself. And then he saw it. The slight curve of her stomach beneath the crisp white fabric of her server's uniform. Pregnant. His stomach dropped. The glass in his hand suddenly felt heavy, his grip tightening around it until his knuckles turned white. No, this wasn't possible. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. If she was pregnant now. His mind reeled, piecing together the implications faster than he could process them. He set the glass down with a force that made the bartender glance up in surprise. Before he could second-guess himself, he was already moving through the crowd, weaving between guests, his eyes locked on Jasmine as she made her way toward the other side of the room. She hadn't seen him yet. Or maybe she had, and she was purposefully avoiding him. She moved with quiet efficiency, balancing an empty tray in her hands as she slipped through the gaps between guests. But Eric saw the way her fingers gripped the tray a little too tightly, the way her shoulders tensed as if she sensed his presence. She was running, not physically, but in the way that mattered. And he wasn't going to let her. He reached her just as she was about to disappear through a side door leading to the back corridors of the hotel. He grabbed her wrist, not hard, but firm enough to stop her. She froze. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't turn. He could hear her breathing, could feel the way her pulse quickened beneath his touch. And then, slowly, she turned her head. Their eyes met. It lasted only a second, but in that second, Eric felt the weight of everything come crashing down on him. Regret, guilt, confusion. He opened his mouth, but he didn't even know what to say. How do you find words for something like this? Jasmine's expression was unreadable, her dark eyes calm but guarded. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, someone she had once known but no longer recognized. Her lips parted, and for a brief moment he thought she might speak first. But instead, she simply pulled her wrist from his grasp, her movements precise, controlled. And then she walked away. Not in a hurry, not as if she were afraid, but as if he didn't matter at all. Eric stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind still trying to catch up with what had just happened. His ex-wife was pregnant. She had never told him, and for the first time in a long, long time, Eric Kingston had no idea what to do next. Eric sat in his office, the city lights casting a faint glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The drink in his hand had long since gone warm, untouched, as he stared blankly at his reflection in the glass. The image that stared back at him was that of a man who had everything. Power, wealth, success, but none of it felt real anymore. Not after what he had seen. Jasmine, pregnant. And she hadn't told him. The thought gnawed at him, eating away at whatever fragile foundation he had been standing on. She had been carrying his child, working as a server at his wedding reception, while he had been parading around with Belinda, smiling for cameras, pretending he was exactly where he was meant to be. He felt sick. Why hadn't she told him? Had she wanted to keep this from him? Or had someone, Belinda, made sure he never found out? The suspicion was immediate, creeping into his thoughts like a venom he couldn't shake. Belinda had been the one to orchestrate everything. His career, his relationships, even the divorce. She had carefully dismantled his marriage piece by piece, ensuring that by the time he and Jasmine had split, he wouldn't even think to question it. What if this was just another piece of the puzzle? Eric grabbed his phone, dialing the one person he knew would have answers. "Sir, I don't know if I should be talking about this." The voice on the other end of the line was hesitant, nervous. "You should." Eric said, his voice sharp, unyielding. You used to work for me. You worked directly under Belinda. I need you to tell me everything. There was a pause, then a slow exhale. Okay, but if she finds out I told you this, I'm done in this industry. She won't find out, Eric assured him. Another pause, and then, it wasn't an accident, sir. The divorce, the way it happened, none of it was an accident. Eric's grip tightened around the phone. I don't know everything, but I know she intercepted things, the voice continued. Emails, messages, anything she thought might make you change your mind about Jasmine, she made sure you never saw it. A slow, sinking feeling settled in Eric's chest. What kind of things? Letters, mostly, from Jasmine. She tried to reach you multiple times. She wrote you after the divorce, but Belinda had them intercepted. She said it was for your own good, that you needed to focus on the company, on your future. Eric's vision blurred with rage. That's not all, the voice added, lower now. The evidence against Jasmine, the photos, the so-called proof that she was cheating. Belinda had them staged. She hired people to make it look real. The air in the office suddenly felt too thick, too suffocating. Belinda had destroyed his marriage, and he had let her. A sharp knock on his office door made him look up. The door swung open before he could respond, and Belinda walked in. She didn't even look surprised to see him still here, despite the late hour. If anything, she looked pleased. There you are, she said, closing the door behind her. You left the reception early. Eric stared at her, his heart pounding. The woman who stood before him, the woman he had once believed to be his perfect match, was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. He set his phone down slowly, his movements calculated. I saw her, Belinda. Belinda blinked, feigning confusion. Who? You know exactly who. His voice was deathly calm. Jasmine. Belinda's expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes, something cold and knowing. And, she said smoothly. Eric pushed back from his desk, standing. She's pregnant. Belinda let out a soft, almost dismissive laugh. Eric, don't tell me you actually believe it's mine. The words were final, unshakable. Belinda's mask didn't crack, but he saw it then. The faint tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled ever so slightly at her sides. And she didn't tell me, he continued, stepping closer. And I think I know why. Belinda met his gaze without flinching. Eric, if she wanted you to know, she would have told you herself. Unless she did tell me, he said, voice hard, and you made sure I never got the message. Silence. For the first time, Belinda's composure wavered. Just slightly. Just enough. How long, Eric demanded, how long have you been lying to me? Eric? How long, Belinda? She let out a slow breath, shaking her head with something almost like pity. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. That was it. That was the moment he knew everything. She wasn't even trying to deny it. His hands curled into fists. You ruined my marriage. I saved you from a mistake, Belinda countered, stepping closer, her tone clipped but firm. You think she would have lasted in your world? You think she could have handled the life you're building? You were weak with her, Eric. You hesitated. You second-guessed yourself. I made you stronger. He stared at her, disgust curling in his gut. You didn't make me stronger, he said, voice low. You made me blind. Belinda's lips thinned. You wouldn't have listened. I just nudged you in the direction you were already headed. Eric exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. He needed to get out of this room before he did something reckless. This conversation is over, he said. We're over." Belinda's expression didn't change, but something icy settled in her gaze. "You don't mean that." "I do." He stepped past her, already reaching for his coat. "You wanted my company? Take it. You wanted my reputation? You can have it, but you will never have me." He didn't wait for her response. Didn't care to see the mask slip. He walked out the door, out of the office, out of everything. There was only one thing that mattered now. He needed to find Jasmine. And this time, he wasn't letting her walk away. Eric stood outside the modest apartment complex, his hands clenched at his sides as he forced himself to take a breath. The building was old but well-maintained, far from the penthouses and luxury suites he was used to, but there was something about it that made his chest tighten. Jasmine lived here. She had been living here, pregnant with his child, while he had been blind to everything that had happened. He wasn't sure what he expected when he found her address. Part of him thought it would be a gated community, something fitting for the woman who had once shared his dreams of success. But standing here now, he realized how much he had assumed, how much he had taken for granted. He adjusted his suit jacket, an unnecessary motion, before stepping up to the door. His heart pounded louder than he cared to admit as he lifted his hand and knocked. A long pause. Then the door opened just enough for Jasmine to appear in the gap. The sight of her hit him like a punch to the gut. She looked different, thinner, her face sharper than he remembered, but still beautiful in a way that made his breath catch. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she wore a simple t-shirt stretched slightly over the curve of her belly. Her hand rested protectively over her stomach as she looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. "Eric?" Her voice was flat, emotionless. He swallowed hard. "Jasmine, can I?" "No." The door moved as if to close, but he quickly placed his hand against it. "Wait, please." She hesitated, her lips pressing into a tight line before she sighed, stepping back just enough to let him in. The apartment was small but tidy, a cozy space that felt lived in. There were baby clothes folded on the couch, a few unopened packages stacked near the wall. A crib stood in the corner, still unassembled, and on the fridge, pinned beneath a magnet, was an ultrasound photo. His chest ached. She had been preparing for their child, alone. Jasmine crossed her arms, her posture defensive as she leaned against the kitchen counter. "Say what you need to say, Eric, and then leave." His throat tightened. This was harder than he expected. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I swear to you, Jasmine, I didn't know you were pregnant." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Of course you didn't. That would have required you to actually talk to me." "I would have if I'd known." "Really?" She cut him off, her eyes flashing. "You would have talked to me? You mean like how you listened when I tried to explain before the divorce? Like how you didn't even hesitate before signing the papers?" He flinched. She had every right to be angry. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice rough. "I trusted the wrong person. I believed things I shouldn't have. But Jasmine, I never would have walked away if I knew about the baby." Her expression didn't change. "Well, you did walk away, and I had to figure everything out by myself. So excuse me if I don't exactly trust that you suddenly care." The weight of her words settled over him, suffocating. She was right. He had left. Maybe not intentionally, maybe not knowing the full truth, but in the end, the result was the same. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and now he had to prove that he wasn't that man anymore. "I want to be here now," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty clawing at him, "for you, for our child. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm not walking away again." Jasmine studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't need you, Eric." The words hurt more than they should have, but before he could respond, she turned away. "I've already figured out how to live without you." And just like that, the conversation was over. Eric left the apartment, the door clicking shut behind him. But as he walked away, he made himself a promise. She didn't need him? Fine. But he was going to prove that he would be there anyway. Eric returned the next day. Jasmine hadn't asked him to, and she certainly hadn't expected him to, but that didn't matter. If he had any chance of proving himself, of showing her that he was serious about being a part of their child's life, then he had to start with consistency. So he arrived at her apartment building just after noon, a bag of groceries in one hand and a small box containing essentials for the baby in the other. He knocked and waited. There was no immediate response, but he could hear movement inside. He knocked again, more insistent this time, and after a long pause the door opened just a crack. Jasmine stood there, looking at him with a mix of frustration and resignation. "I told you, I don't need anything from you, Eric," she said, her voice firm but quieter than the night before. "I know," he replied evenly, "but I'm here anyway." She exhaled sharply, rubbing her forehead as if warding off a headache. "You can't just show up whenever you feel guilty." "That's not why I'm here," he said, holding up the bag. "Groceries, fresh produce, some prenatal vitamins, things you need." Her eyes flicked to the bag, and for the first time something flickered in her expression. Uncertainty, maybe even the briefest hesitation. She glanced behind her, and Eric could see a small pile of unopened bills on the counter. She wasn't struggling, not exactly, but he could tell that things weren't easy for her. With a reluctant sigh, she stepped aside, allowing him inside. The apartment looked much the same as the day before. The crib was still unassembled, baby clothes still folded neatly on the couch, and the ultrasound photo still pinned to the fridge. As he set the groceries down on the small dining table, he took in the quiet details of her life, how she had been preparing alone, how she had built a future for their child without any expectation of him being there. "You didn't have to do this," she muttered, crossing her arms as she watched him unpack. "I know," he said, glancing up at her, "but I want to." She didn't respond, but she didn't tell him to leave either. That, at least, was progress. Over the next few days, he continued to show up, not with grand gestures or empty promises, but with small, practical things. One day, it was fresh groceries. Another day, he brought over a new humidifier after noticing the dry air in her apartment. On a particularly cold afternoon, he arrived with a thick maternity coat, insisting that she needed something warmer. Jasmine fought him on that one, but in the end, she accepted it, albeit with an exasperated sigh. The real turning point came a week later when he showed up to find her struggling to put together the crib. She was kneeling on the floor, instructions spread out beside her, a screwdriver in one hand and a look of deep concentration on her face. The second she saw him standing in the doorway, she scowled. "Don't say a word," she warned. Eric held up his hands in surrender. "Wouldn't dream of it." She huffed but moved aside as he crouched down beside her, taking the instructions from her hands. They worked in silence at first, the only sounds being the occasional click of screws fitting into place and the quiet hum of the city outside. But as the crib started to take shape, the tension between them began to ease, just slightly. "You know," Jasmine said after a while, her tone almost amused, "I never pictured you doing this." Eric glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "What, assembling furniture. Being here, she admitted, sticking around after everything. He tightened a bolt, considering his words carefully before answering. I never should have left in the first place. She didn't respond immediately, but he saw the way her fingers paused over the wooden rail of the crib, her posture shifting ever so slightly. You can't change the past, Eric, she said finally, her voice softer than before. But that doesn't mean I can just forget it. I don't expect you to, he said, meeting her gaze. But I'm not going anywhere this time. She studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since their reunion, she didn't look at him with anger or resentment. Instead, there was something else, something more fragile, more uncertain. Hope. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. The weeks passed, and slowly the air between them began to shift. Eric continued to show up, not just with gifts or necessities, but with his presence. He learned her new routines, how she liked her tea in the mornings, the brand of lotion she used on her growing belly, the way she sometimes sat on the couch at night, staring at the crib with a quiet, contemplative expression. He never pushed her to talk about the past, and she never offered. But she allowed him into her space, little by little, and that was more than he could have hoped for. Then, one afternoon, he finally got what he had been waiting for. Jasmine sat on the couch, her legs stretched out, one hand resting absent-mindedly on her belly. Eric had brought over takeout from her favorite place, and to his surprise she hadn't protested. He sat across from her, watching as she took slow bites, her gaze distant but not entirely closed off. After a long silence, she spoke. I have an ultrasound appointment tomorrow. Her voice was neutral, like she was testing the weight of the words. You don't have to come, but I thought I should tell you. Eric stilled. It was the first time she had acknowledged him as a part of this process, as a part of the baby's life. I want to be there, he said without hesitation. Jasmine didn't react right away, just nodded slightly and went back to eating. But the fact that she had told him at all meant more than she probably realized. The next morning, Eric arrived at her apartment early. He expected resistance, maybe another reminder that she didn't need him, but Jasmine simply grabbed her coat and walked beside him to the car without a word. It was a quiet drive, the tension between them no longer as sharp, but still present, like a scar that had yet to fade. At the clinic, they sat in the waiting area, surrounded by other expecting parents. Couples holding hands, excited whispers filling the room. Eric glanced at Jasmine, wondering if she felt the weight of it the way he did. If she had imagined a different version of this moment, one where they were still together, still whole. Her name was called, and he followed her into the small examination room. The technician greeted them warmly, chatting as she prepared the ultrasound. Jasmine reclined on the table, her shirt lifted just enough to expose her rounded belly. The moment the screen flickered to life, Eric felt his breath catch. There it was. Their baby. Small, but unmistakably real. The rhythmic sound of the heartbeat filled the room, steady and strong, and for the first time since all of this began, Eric felt the weight of everything settle fully on his shoulders. He had missed so much. That's the baby, Jasmine said softly, her gaze fixed on the screen. He looked at her then, at the way her expression softened, the way she held her breath just a little, as if afraid to disturb the moment. Our baby, he corrected quietly. She didn't argue. For the first time in a long time, they weren't on opposite sides. They weren't fighting or pushing each other away. For the first time, they were just two people staring at the future they had created. And Eric knew, whatever it took, whatever he had to prove, he wasn't going to let this slip away again. Eric had never been the type to believe in second chances. In his world, the world of business, of power, of relentless ambition, mistakes were rarely forgiven, and time never moved backward. But, sitting in Jasmine's apartment that evening, watching as she carefully folded tiny baby clothes, he realized that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't as rigid as he had always thought. The ultrasound had changed something between them. It wasn't dramatic, nor did it erase all the pain and betrayal that lingered like a shadow between them, but it had shifted the air just enough for them to breathe again. Jasmine hadn't pushed him away when he drove her home from the clinic. She hadn't rolled her eyes when he carried the groceries inside without asking. And now, as they sat together in the living room, the glow of the small lamp casting soft light over the room, she wasn't looking at him with resentment anymore. She wasn't looking at him with trust either. But trust was something to be earned. As he watched her fold another onesie, smoothing the fabric with careful precision, he finally spoke. "I know you don't believe me yet," he said, his voice steady, "and I don't blame you for that, but I meant what I said before. I'm not leaving again." Jasmine didn't look up right away. Instead, she placed the folded onesie onto the growing pile before finally meeting his gaze. "You think just showing up fixes everything?" she asked, though there was no venom in her voice. "No," he admitted. "I think it's a start." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words against the years of hurt between them. Then she exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I don't know if I'll ever trust you again, Eric," she said, and though her voice was soft, the honesty in it was sharp. He nodded, accepting the weight of her words. "I'll spend the rest of my life earning that trust if I have to." Jasmine sighed, rubbing a hand over her belly. She looked tired, not just physically, but emotionally, as if carrying this burden alone for so long had worn her down in ways she hadn't even realized. "I don't know if that's enough," she murmured. "Maybe not," he agreed, "but it's all I've got." Another silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't heavy with anger or regret. It was simply there. A quiet, fragile thing, uncertain but real. Eric glanced toward the unfinished crib in the corner of the room. "Do you want some help putting that together?" Jasmine followed his gaze before letting out a tired chuckle. "I was going to do it tomorrow." "I'm here now." She hesitated as if debating whether to let him into this part of her life. Then, finally, she nodded. "All right," she said. "Let's see if you're as good at building cribs as you are at ruining relationships." Eric huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head as he rolled up his sleeves. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a clean slate, but it was a chance. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Don't forget to subscribe for more. If you enjoyed this, check out the next video or explore others on the channel. And if you found this interesting, share it with someone who might like it too.